Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode. In this video, I would like to go over an older Paul Krugman article entitled "Is Bitcoin Evil?" And for those of you who are blissfully unaware, Paul Krugman is a writer and an economist that typically appears in the New York Times. You see him as a talking head on many shows, and in fairness to him, at one point he did win a Nobel Prize in economics for something, but I really can't remember what. Now, in this particular article, he kind of starts off by saying that there are two criteria for a currency to be successful. One of them is that it needs to work as a medium of exchange, meaning that you have a fair degree of certainty that if you go to a store or any place, you can likely exchange the currency for a good or a service. And I kind of laughed at this and how he put this. He said for a currency to work, it needs to be reasonably stable store of value. And why I found this so funny is because obviously if you look at the history of the US dollar or any currency that gets a central bank, it loses value over time actually relatively quickly. You can see how much the US dollar has declined in value since the creation of the Fed. And so it's kind of funny that he puts it as a reasonably stable store of value. I guess it sounds better than a rapidly declining store of value, which is what the US dollar actually is. Now, kind of to my surprise actually, Krugman kind of makes his first attacks on Bitcoin saying that he doubts that it can be seen as a reasonable store of value. And I think at this point we should kind of go into what typically makes a good currency, because Krugman's going to talk about this a little bit later. For one thing, for a currency to work, it needs to be relatively rare. So for example, in the past, this is why we use gold, because gold is actually hard to get as opposed to pine cones or leaves. It needs to be inert, meaning that it's not going to be changed very easily. So again, gold works quite well in this fashion, whereas something like hamburgers would not, because your hamburgers would spoil, within a week, or maybe not if they're McDonald's hamburgers, but that's a different issue actually. And finally, it needs to be easy to modify. So you can get the currency in bigger or smaller amounts. Again, with gold, it was relatively easy to melt it down, for example, as opposed to another metal like platinum. And of course, with paper currency, you can just print out $10, $20, $100, or $1 trillion if you happen to be in Zimbabwe. But Krugman quotes another gentleman, and it seems to be he's trying to make the point that for a currency to have a reasonable store of value, it needs to have a practical purpose beyond just being a medium of exchange. And this is one thing I don't really buy. This is the first part of the article that I really don't buy, in that he says, in gold, at the end of the day, you can also make things out of it. You can make jewelry. It has practical uses in electronics, etc. And although that's true, I see no reason why a currency needs that. All it needs is to be able to hold value and for other people to be willing voluntarily to exchange a good or service for the currency. The fact you can make something out of it, I think, is utterly irrelevant. And even more amusingly is he seems to state that the fiat dollar has a use beyond a store of value and a medium of exchange, and that you can use them to pay your taxes. I think this is a laughable point to make. If it's up to me, I would rather keep my money so long as it's secure in something like Bitcoin, and then exchange Bitcoin for dollars to pay my taxes, as opposed to keeping all my money in dollars and guaranteeing watching it go down in value over time. I'm sure if you're in Venezuela right now, 5 years ago, you probably wish you had all of your money in Bitcoin as opposed to Venezuelan bolivars, for example. So he attempts to use this, that paying taxes somehow lends a legitimacy to a currency, and I just don't think that's the case at all. I think he's dead wrong on that. Another more interesting point that he makes that I find to be doubtful is that you want a ceiling on the value of the currency, and we're going to get into this a bit more. But obviously, gold, when it increases in value, it is likely to be the supply of it is likely to increase, as it will make mining that much more attractive. So that acts as a ceiling on the value of the currency. Although again, I'm not sure you even want that, but we'll get into that. And then he says did the same thing with the fiat dollar, but this is again is a laughable point because yeah, there's a ceiling on the dollar, but it's guaranteed to go down. It is gone down from its inception. I mean, you don't need a ceiling when you're just digging down to the center of the earth. So how that is a plus for the fiat dollar is odd to me. Oh, and then he also makes, I think, the laughable claim that there's actually a floor on the dollar as well, as the Fed will officially buy back dollars if it were ever to drop. And I'm not aware of it ever doing that. And the fact of the matter is, every paper currency, every current currency throughout the history of the world, the ultimate value of it is always zero. And different central banks may try and fight that, but there's political reasons why it never really works out that way. So I'm just not buying that argument either. Now, I just kind of want to explore this whole theory that having a ceiling on the value of a currency is a good thing, because I don't think it is at all. I mean, if you have to store your work in a currency, because that's essentially what you're doing. Anytime you do work in exchange for currency, you're saying, okay, I've done this much work, either as a good or service, but I don't want anything right now. I don't want to exchange it for anything. I'm going to have a currency I can use later. Does it not make more sense to have a currency that will increase in value as opposed to one that is decreasing in value? Now, the reason why Krugman and really the majority of the economics profession would say you want a decline in currency is they kind of point to typically the Great Depression and the deflation that was experienced during the Depression. And I just think this is an absolutely piss poor reading of it, because you can get an action or an effect for two different reasons, and it depends on what those reasons are. So in the case of the Great Depression, if you're experiencing prices going down because companies are going bankrupt and less people can afford to buy things, then that's obviously a bad thing. But on the other hand, if you're seeing prices decline because of increases in productivity, that's very much a good thing. Now, to statist economists like Paul Krugman, he in theory doesn't like the idea of prices declining, because to him that people will not spend as much money then. If you know your dollar is going to be worth a bit more a month from now, or 2 weeks or 2 months from now, maybe you're going to hold back, and this is going to somehow set up a depression. And again, I just find that to be a terrible analysis as well. And for me, the big example is the personal computer industry. There has not been a more dynamic industry in the past 30 years. But one thing that we all know from buying computers is that if you wait a month or 6 months, your dollar is going to go that much further. And yet you still buy computers now, or phones or what have you. But the reason why is because you're buying that thing for the right reason. That's that you actually want to use it. And that's what you want. Now, taken to the extreme, in the old USSR, what you used to do when you were paid in rubles is you would take your rubles and you go to the store and you would buy anything you possibly could, Paul Krugman like, because you had no faith that currency was going to hold its value. In fact, you had faith that it wasn't going to. So if you went into the store and they only had hula hoops there, you would buy as many hula hoops as possible because you could possibly exchange the hula hoop for something valuable later on. Now, obviously, this is incredibly inefficient, and there's actually a fancy word in economics for it, but essentially it leads to bad planning because you're not buying things because you want them or need them, but you're buying things because you have no faith in their currency. And that is in fact what Krugman and others of his ilk are actually advocating. And yeah, so again, you want people to buy things because you need them, not because they don't have faith in the currency. So the fact that Bitcoin is, or something similar to it, or is likely to keep increasing over time, is not a bad thing. Now, finally, we kind of really get to it here, and Krugman quotes a blog post by a science fiction author I had never heard of before named Charlie Stross, and I have the link below. But he says, when he's attacking the idea of cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, he doesn't like them because he feels they're going to damage central banks, they're going to impair the ability of the government to collect taxes, and also kind of prevent them from monitoring financial transactions. And again, it kind of depends how you see central banks. I think he's right about all of this, but I think this is actually a good thing. Having currencies separate from national governments, I think, are fantastic, because the problem with allowing governments to print their own currencies is that that's exactly what they do, and they have no problem counterfeiting more and more currency, essentially taxing without being honest about it in order to bribe more votes. And that's sort of been the beginning of the end of all civilizations. And I'll put a link below to a much earlier video I made, in which I make the point that when civilizations die, it's always because of the money. And cryptocurrencies or non-national currencies kind of present the hope that this vicious cycle may actually end. I mean, having a cryptocurrency or a non-national currency does not necessarily mean that the government can't offer services of various kinds. It just means they're going to have to offer them honestly through honest taxation. And when you do that, you quickly become aware of just how inefficient government is in many aspects. At least that's what I suspect would happen. But let's go. And also, just in my opinion, and this is likely to be a whole video on its own, I suspect, is that when people worry about the wealth gap, or how you have these kind of all this paper currency flying around, that's the creation of central banks. I mean, if you're poor and you don't have any assets, and central banks are constantly inflating things, yeah, you're going to get relatively poorer, as opposed to the very rich who have very real assets in the form of real estate or investments of various kinds or what have you. So as far as the gap between rich and poor, quite opposed to what a Charlie Stross might think, keeping things honest with an honest currency is going to combat that a long way, as opposed to the fraud of central banking and fractional reserve banking. So to kind of conclude, to answer Paul Krugman, Bitcoin is not evil. In fact, I think it's potentially as a way of being a much more honest currency than what we currently have. But of course, that's what I think. So I'm kind of curious what you think. So if you want to leave any comments below, I would very much like to read them. If you like this video, please feel free to like and subscribe. And other than that, thank you for watching, and until next time.